Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review, a subsection of the Like Iron podcast where we pick an academic article and discuss it. If you enjoy nerding out about strength, fitness, and performance, this is the podcast for you. Remember, research is ever-changing, and our views and opinions will change as well. None of the information in this show should be seen as medical advice, and you should always talk to your medical provider before starting a fitness regimen. Let's get into the cast, Like Iron.
Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review, a subsection of our Like Iron podcast. Take a look at specific articles in the fitness, performance, injury, basically just human performance and function fields. And take a look at an article, talk about it, talk about the specifics, how to apply it in practice. And yeah, so this week we have a journal article entitled Strength and Hypertrophy Adaptations Between Low versus High Load Resistance Training, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. I'm here with my co-host,
Wes.
That's Wes. I'm Shannon. This article was written by Brad Schoenfeld and his company of co-authors, whose names I can't pronounce.
Except James Krieger.
Except James Krieger. Yeah, so basically this article takes a look at high load versus low load training. Wes is going to give us a little synopsis of what a systematic review is and what a meta-analysis is. So I'll let him do that, and then we'll actually go into the topic itself.
Okay, cool. So a meta-analysis in basic terms is a study of studies. And so basically, when you run a meta-analysis, you pull together a bunch of studies, and then you analyze basically what all these studies found, what is the, commonality between all these studies. That way you can kind of see what does the literature at large say rather than just one individual study or just like cherry-picking studies that, support a certain bias. You can say, okay, what does the majority or everything that fits our criteria say about a given topic? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so as far as levels of evidence, meta-analysis and systematic reviews are pretty high on there.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that a systematic review or meta-analysis is only as good as the individual parts that are into it. So if you do a systematic review on a bunch of poorly run studies, it's a pretty poor systematic review. So just because it's a systematic review doesn't mean it's high-level evidence.
Even then, like the systematic review could have been carried out well, by all the guidelines, but shit in and shit out, So like the systematic review could be good, but it could just be looking at crap, really. And so usually to avoid that to the best of people's abilities, there's usually some sort of inclusion-exclusion criteria to do the best to look at similar methodologies. Are we are we comparing, apples to oranges? Are we actually making a true comparison between things, or as close as we possibly can to hopefully avoid, shit in, shit out?
Yeah. And good systematic reviews will mention those limitations of those studies. Yeah. They always take a look at the quality of the studies based on some criteria. I think on this one they used the Pedro scale, which is basically just scale to look at the quality of the singular studies based on certain criteria.
Yeah, so like in this one of the things that you'll see a lot, and we'll discuss it a little bit later, is when they're doing a search strategy, these guys use the preferred reporting items for systematic review and meta-analysis, which is PRISMA is the acronym. And so following certain, standards when you're conducting a systematic review and meta-analysis kind of help eliminate, again, the shit in, shit out, or at least controlled a little bit better.
So again, this study is looking at high load versus low load training. And so I think in this systematic review, high load is anything above 60%.
Yeah, the way they defined it is low load was less than or equal to 60% of 1 rep max, and high load was greater than 60% of 1 rep max.
Yes, and they also say some studies, rather than using a percentage, they did like repetition maximums, so like up to 15 percent or up to a 15 rep max
Yep.
was low or high load, and anything above a 15 rep max was low load. So again, the study looked at kind of outcomes of those two criteria for basically muscular strength
Yep.
and hypertrophy. So they looked at comparing hypertrophy adaptations, a 1 rep max, and isometric strength. They tried to look at some other stuff such as isotonic, so which is like, isokinetic. They didn't have enough
Yeah, usually
information there.
Again, with a meta-analysis, kind of going back to this, if the studies that are making up the meta-analysis didn't measure those things, you can't make a comparison. And so if you don't have enough studies looking at different metrics, like Shannon was saying, isometric, isokinetic, or isotonic, you can really only make comparisons of the ones that actually measure whatever you're measuring in the meta-analysis. And so, unfortunately, they didn't have enough studies or statistical power to look at some of those metrics, but they did have enough to look at muscle hypertrophy and isotonic strength and isometric strength.
Yep. So in popular exercise science and basically if you go through school or you start reading the basics of kind of resistance training, there is a commonly prescribed rep ranges for different adaptations like strength or hypertrophy. So generally people say to get strength adaptations, you need to train like 70% or above of your 1 rep max in a rep range of 1 to 6. And then for hypertrophy, they usually say 6 to 12 reps, again, kind of above 70% to get that adaptation, where this study looks at much lower percentages for those adaptations, and we actually get some surprising results. Why don't you talk about that, Wes?
Yeah, sure. So I think getting into the meat and potatoes of the results, what we end up finding is that when it comes to isotonic strength, and so the isotonic is relating to like concentric and eccentric movement, so like moving the weight up and moving the weight down. Concentrically, we see that heavy load leads to better isotonic strength than the light load, which conceptually is a given. It makes sense. It's kind of due to specificity. If you're training with heavier loads, that's more specific to a 1 rep max than when you're training with really light loads. However, something that is interesting is although the high loads saw greater improvements in isotonic strength, the low load group still improved. Like there was still an improvement from baseline, which is interesting. And so although it is less specific, you can still get improvements, although not as great. When it comes to hypertrophy, it's really interesting because, like Shannon mentioned at the beginning, it's been thought at least that you would need higher loads to have an increase in strength and hypertrophy, or that would be better than the low load group. But in this study, or in this meta-analysis, they didn't find a difference. And so that means that both are equally as effective for hypertrophy, which is interesting. And I think this can be hypothesized due to, motor unit recruitment. And this basically means that when you're lifting very, very high loads, basically you're going to get low threshold to high threshold motor units are recruited. So you're basically using, I guess, conceptually, a very, very large amount of muscle to get that load done. But when you're using light loads, you only need, a handful of motor units because they are lighter. However, because with these light loads and high loads in this study, they were all taken to volitional failure. That means they're all taken very, very, close, if not all the way to someone failing. And so due to this failure, light loads means that they're going to have a lot more volume, per set to get to that failure. And so potentially due to fatigue, you'll get like motor unit cycling. And so you'll have some motor units that are working at given times, and then once they get fatigued, others will take over. And so potentially this will cause enough of a stimulus to have similar levels of hypertrophy, I guess is a speculation. But all in all, you see in this meta-analysis very similar results in hypertrophy or muscle growth.
That was a very good summary. One thing, you mentioned the strength, and they do mention this, I think, in the discussion. Most of these studies were done on untrained people. I think only 2 were actually trained in, the cohort was trained in resistance training. So that's something important to mention. because it's likely that if you're training for a 1 rep max strength, it's likely that the more advanced you are, the more trained you are, the more the kind of the law of specificity is applicable. So the more advanced you are, the more likely it is that you have to train regularly with high loads to lift high loads.
Yeah.
That being said, I think this study shows us that low load can have a place in training, especially when you talk about just kind of periodizing in general. And that if your goal is, especially if your goal is only hypertrophy and it's not 1 rep max strength, then you have a multitude of rep ranges and ways that you can put on some muscle. And so it's likely that varying that so you get a different response is important.
Yeah, I think we can kind of get into the practical takeaways of this. And we'll start with a couple, but one that comes to my mind right now is, let's say someone's dealing with some sort of like nagging injury or whatever you want to call it, and they're sensitive to high load training. And so whenever they train with high loads, or at this period in time in their training program, high loads, they're just really sensitive to it and they're not getting great training in just due to discomfort. And let's say that the goal of the block that they're in is to accumulate volume. Then, lowering the load and having them train, with pretty high efforts can still be a useful way to train. Like they can still get a decent amount of training volume in if they can tolerate that. And they may or may not be able to, but I guess based on my own anecdote is when I'm dealing with some clients or even myself, and someone is a little bit more sensitive to higher intensities, then lower intensities seem to be more tolerable. But then this caveat, the volumes are usually a little bit higher in that case. But it could be useful in some sort of, injury, dealing around with or working around an injury. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really good point, because it just means that there's multiple ways to get a certain adaptation.
Yeah.
And it's just more tools in your toolbox. I kind of hate that phrase.
Yeah.
But it's more useful tools in your toolbox.
Yeah.
And they actually mention this, that the hypertrophy adaptations may be fiber specific. So there's not quite enough literature out there or evidence to be sure on this or even have a strong conclusion. But basically those low loads, they're saying you'll generally see more muscular hypertrophy in like type 1 with low loads, and type 2 is high loads. So they say in this that it may be more optimal to work in a variety of rep ranges if your goal is muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Because if you're building more type 1 muscle with low loads and then you switch to high loads and build type 2, you're kind of optimizing the amount of muscle growth you get.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because, you see with a lot of, I guess, topics in exercise science, you see mixed literature or people extrapolating or just like conjecture or speculation on this stuff. And then some support the idea that, there's fiber type specific adaptations, and some are either null or have, they'll find that there'll be an equal amount, of type 2 and type 1 hypertrophy within just a given, training program. So it is kind of interesting because it is somewhat mixed. But yeah, I mean, speculatively, it could be really interesting to see in a long-term study, if, maybe there was fiber-specific adaptations. That could be really interesting. I think it's also useful to consider, in a periodized program, you're not always going to be training like hyper-specific to your goals. Mm-hmm. Due to things like the repeated bout effect and other things as well. But taking a period of time to try to develop hypertrophy with the aims of hopefully that correlating with long-term strength, there's some debate there as well. I think there's good reason to believe that everything else being equal, a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle. Still, it's kind of a little murky with the literature there. But taking time to develop, hypertrophy further away from a competition, if you're a power lifter, it can be useful to lift with lower loads, maybe less specific movements, and you'll see, hypertrophy, hopefully. And then as you approach a competition, getting more specific to the task. Similarly in the study, we saw with the heavy training, an increase in isotonic strength, and in powerlifting, the movements are, isotonic movements. And so you're getting more specific to those, meaning like the movement gets more specific. So now you're starting to do the competition lifts, the rep ranges and the intensities get more specific. So the reps are a little bit lower, the intensity is higher. I think, again, this is just the study goes back to demonstrate the principle of specificity and why, it is very important, because you'll basically see adaptations that are specific to the demands applied to it. Anything else that you want to add practically to that?
Not really. I think this just gives us more evidence that there's just a multitude of ways we can achieve goals.
Yep.
Especially if that goal is hypertrophy.
Yep.
It's definitely leaning more towards, has more efficacy for hypertrophy than strength.
Yeah. So I think this is interesting because this shows, there's kind of like the spectrum of which you can train. And when I was growing up, and even at the beginning of this paper, they talk about how it's been currently believed that strength, you're going to be training with higher percentages of 1 rep max in like the 1 to 5 rep range. And then, hypertrophy will be lower percent 1 rep max in like the 6 to 12 rep range. And so, I wouldn't say that those are false. I would say those are incomplete, meaning that it can be a good strategy to train in those ranges for strength, because 1 to 5 is more that range. You can have higher intensities and is more specific to, the 1 rep max, but it doesn't mean that hypertrophy won't happen in those ranges either. And also similarly with the 6 to 12 rep range, although, that's getting less specific to a 1 rep max, you can still accumulate a good amount of volume there. You can get, a decent amount of volume, again, it has been, I guess, suggested to be one of the most important variables for hypertrophy. And so if you can accumulate more volume in those ranges, that could also be useful. And so I think it just goes to show you that it's not like this range is strength and this range is hypertrophy. It's like, it's more of, what does it look like when you take a step back and you say, okay, what is the volume and what is the average intensity within my program, and how is that, I guess, set up in a periodized program throughout time. So rather than it just being black white like strength hypertrophy, I think it's more of like you're probably going to be getting a little bit of both, whatever you decide to train. But maybe having more reps per set is more efficient for your time, because one thing I've noticed is you can try to accumulate a lot of volume with really high intensity. So like maybe you're doing like 7 or 8 sets of like 4 or 5, but then at least with me, it seems like the rest intervals get much longer. Then all of a sudden your training sessions are really long. And so trying to accumulate all your volume with higher intensity might not be a great idea for the sake of time, or even just for the sake of, performance, when in reality, maybe you can be accumulating more volume with more reps per set, especially if time is a concern. And if it's taken relatively close to, failure or within a high amount of effort, I would say between like probably in the 6 to 10 RPE range, then you're probably getting, enough of a stimulus to cause some sort of growth. What do you think about that?
No, I agree completely. It just gives us, again, more variation we can employ.
Yeah.
And like most things, especially in science, but the more we learn, the more you learn in exercise sciences, things aren't black and white.
Yeah.
Rep ranges aren't black and white. It's everything's gray. The world is gray. So you got to get comfortable with that.
Yeah, and this goes back to multiple previous podcasts where we talked about monitoring the individual. It comes back to, these are mean responses. You can take a scientific approach to your own practice, and you can monitor the individual and see how they respond. And then you can give things a try, see if it worked as well as was planned. And if not, change the dose, change something, and monitor again. And then this is how, over time, you can develop a good training strategy for you or your clients.
All right. Anything else?
I think that's it.
Sweet. This has been an episode of the Like Iron Research Review. We will talk to you next time.